I'd love to turn it to a little bit of enhancing our civic systems from a movement building perspective. We were briefly talking about it, and I'd love to hear from your own words. What are the main categories you see that humanity has to work on to enhance our civic systems to push forward towards a bigger, brighter future for all?
Well, I'm of the mindset, personally now, that the big generation-defining issues that we face today are climate change and economic mobility. And to me, in my perspective, everything else is secondary because those two are a point of crisis. I believe that every generation hears a call, right? And it's incumbent on us to choose whether or not we are going to rise up to that call. And I believe every region, every city, every state has to determine what are the unique challenges and the unique assets that people have and how they respond to that particular call. And so that's why I think this is actually a wonderful time, and it's a wonderful place to have this discussion because we are, first of all, we're in Massachusetts, land of the firsts, right? But secondly, we are in fact the Silicon Valley of the East. A huge asset that we have is our tight unemployment rate, 2.4% according to the mayor at the last State of the City, right? People need a workforce, right? There's a commercial need for the talent that has been lying dormant, right? Now is the time to celebrate and elevate that sort of hitherto untapped talent pool and say this is the solution to Boston's tight labor market. This is the future of Boston's technical workforce. Let's do that. Let's respond to the call.
Well, I was very struck in watching one of the videos that you have President Kennedy calling, ask not what your country can do for you. So we definitely have that tradition, although I think sometimes we forget it and we don't live by it. I want to expand this a little bit. I think the 2.4% low unemployment rate is really about Boston. Yes. And as somebody who has been to Fall River and Holyoke and many other, Lowell and Lawrence, in Lawrence, the median household income for the entire household is $29,000. That's what an entire household is living on. So, meaning half are below that. So it's not easy to just show up in Boston and get one of those jobs because if you don't have the job, you don't have any place to live because part of the tight labor market is also the very tight housing market. So how do you see this becoming available to, let's say, the young people of Holyoke, which is an interesting city, has its own power company, has actually municipal cable and other things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, has a long history as the first industrially planned city, has canals that generate hydroelectric power running through the city. So in some ways, it is a model of 19th century innovation, and yet it is having real trouble meeting the needs of the Latino community and so many others out there. So how would you see this spreading to help meet the needs more broadly in this state?
Yeah, I think the challenges of the gateway cities are another set of challenges. Mm-hmm. We have the unique asset in Boston that we have a lot of industry here, presumably more industry than is in a lot of these gateway cities.
Right.
I'm a big proponent of local solutions to national problems, mm-hmm. right? An example of this in Lawrence is the Alliance for Business Leadership recently led a program out there called Lawrence Leads. Mm-hmm. And they just got a bunch of local leaders together to just discuss what these problems are and come up with some sort of local solution. Mm-hmm. I wasn't there, so I certainly can't speak to all that they came up with, but I know that one example of one of the many things they discussed was, well, opportunity zones and opportunity funds. Is there a way to do this in a way that is beneficial to Lawrence? Mm-hmm. And so they started, to my knowledge, I believe they actually started their own opportunity fund, mm-hmm. So that it could be managed in a way that would ameliorate rather than exacerbate a gentrification crisis, mm-hmm. and help uplift not just Lawrence industry, but Lawrence people. Mm-hmm. That's just one example of local solutions that are coming up now in response to our economic.
I have to tell you, I'm from Somerville, and cool. Somerville's motto is municipal freedom brings national strength. And the first time I saw that motto, I thought, what does that mean, really? And now I think it's a version of this, that allowing and by the way, I'm the biggest Somerville fan in the state, just because it has such a wonderful balance between opportunities and culture and ethnic, racial diversity, class diversity, intense artistic creativity. So, you know, in a town of 75,000 people, I think we have a remarkable working model. But we benefit from being close to Boston. So I'd like to keep going a little bit on that, but put it also in the light that Tom was just talking about. This show is called Creating the World We Want. And, you know, I joke that it's because so many people feel like it's putting up with the world we got stuck with. I think a lot of people feel disempowered in the face of the forces that are working on us. And so we here, you know, we want to understand more deeply what the origin of these problems are. That's great, but that's in part an academic idea. Let's just understand it. Well, then the question is, what are we going to do about it? And how do we have a role? And just to finish that thought, one of the things I can't stand anymore is people sitting around saying, you know, if only those people over there did something. If only the people in Congress or on Beacon Hill, that's true. And I believe in putting pressure on people to act. But we have to get out of the mindset that we will only make progress if someone else does something. Yep. So riffing on that is, you know, taking what seems to be a successful model and an exciting way to build equity. Dr. Atiyah Martin was talking about building equity. How would you say to our audience, in your field, here's how we and you can help create the world we want?
Absolutely. I love those finger waggers too.
Yeah.
The finger waggers and also the slacktivists.
Yeah.
The slacktivists who post on Facebook and they're like, cool, I did my thing for the day.
He's been clicking things out on his phone while we're talking. So.
I think that for everyone, it's going to be a unique thing, right? Yeah. There's a certain degree of self-discovery and an understanding of self within a broader societal and even historic context, right? Mm-hmm. In our case specifically, we just invite people to have uncomfortable conversations, right? A great example of this is that some of our employers are talking to us not because a CEO or COO or CTO came and spoke to us. It's the employees themselves who at a certain point said, look, we're writing a lot about diversity. We've got all the blog posts and the tweets and the marketing material and the ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. What are we doing? Right? They look around them, what are we actually doing?
Yeah.
Por favor, right? And so those are individuals who are sitting down with senior leadership at their companies and asking, what are our KPIs? Mm-hmm. What are the metrics?
Which is?
Sorry, key performance indicators. Yeah. How do we know that we are living up to our own stated commitment to equity and diversity in the workplace? Because if there is no actual indicator of success, then at the end of the day, this is all success theater. Right? We can sit there and run around and write blog posts. Who is like, let's actually get it done, and let's start with an understanding of what it means to get it done. And these conversations don't always come from senior leadership. They come from interested employees who want to make a difference. And those start with uncomfortable conversations around what are we doing?
So let's say somebody's watching this and they say, I've just thought about where I work or this group that I'm in. I want to have an uncomfortable conversation. I don't want to be uncomfortable, but I want to raise this. Either of you, do you have thoughts about how to do that? I mean, what's the right setting and opportunity?
I think it's going to be different per circumstance, per situation, per person. So I certainly don't want to suggest that I'm casting a one-size-fits-all solution here. But I think a big part of it is understanding who it is that has the lever of power in any given organization. And then just starting by saying, this issue means a lot to me. And I worry that we're not really doing anything about it. What are we doing about it? At that point, typically, you're going to get some sort of like a canned response. Well, we care deeply about it, and we have made the sort of Herculean feat of removing our own unconscious bias when interviewing people, which, you know, hooray for them. But we got to take one step further and ask, great, how? What does success look like? What are we actually doing? How are we getting there as a company? How can I play a role? And I think not letting people off the hook right away and saying, let's actually come up with what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean for our company is a great start.
And from my perspective as well, I think that we have to hold our leaders accountable in the public space. I think that too often it's difficult to even embrace these conversations in a public sphere. So we have to make sure that as media, as citizens that care, we have to be asking our leaders, how are we acting? How are we instituting public policy that carries over to the private sector, that makes sure that our public sector and private sector leaders are held accountable to act and bring these issues to light? Because as we briefly discussed, these aren't necessarily at the forefront of public discussion right now. And there's a reason for that. We're just not talking about, but it takes a lot of individuals holding leaders accountable, starting the conversation with the levers of power per se, and eventually, this is an issue that affects everybody. So if we can, one day at a time, chip away and bring this to the zeitgeist of conversation of our era, I'm confident we can instill economic mobility across the board, hopefully. But a follow-up question would be, how have you seen opportunities for public space to impact the private space, in the tech field towards economic mobility? You could touch on climate change if you think that would be a more relevant, issue that you've seen some public sector opportunities for leaders to make policy change.
So how can this work be impacted by policy specifically? That's a really good question. I think that there are some ideas that are starting to percolate. I feel like Boston is not bad at this when it comes to the trades, right? The building trades. So there are programs out there that take a vocational approach where young people come out of high school and they do a track that trains them specifically for the building trades. And I also believe there is a certain amount of municipal legislation that requires certain investments in local workforce that influence how buildings are built, like who literally builds them, who the jobs actually go to. And boy, this is something that I would love to see in tech, right? An example of this is, I saw the recent proposal that, the Amazon HQ2 proposal, and there are a lot of things in there that are being proposed that we should just do, right? Like an additional investment in workforce, specifically technical workforce. Right now, there isn't really a lot of city or state level investment specifically in technology. I should say the state is starting to do some of that with the apprenticeship model. But there's a model here to which we can just add water, right? If we can just give some of our workforce providers.
Let me wonk out on you on it for a second on something that's happening globally that we're seeing pieces of here. But one of the things that I did going back 20 years is ask the question, what does it mean when a company says that it creates value? Because if you ask a CEO or they'll say, what are you doing? Well, we're creating value. Well, what does that mean? Well, for a very long time, what that meant is we're making money. And we're making money that gets drawn to the top and distributed to shareholders or distributed to people at the top. And the word value meant money. But under the pressure of the concept of sustainability, where we're not only asking how much money does a company make, but what impact does it have on the community, on the planet, that led to a question of, well, what are the non-financial indicators that we can ask companies to provide so that we see? You mentioned key performance indicators. Well, so what that led to is a global system now called the Global Reporting Initiative, and that was something that I founded and that I was the initial chair of. Now, the interesting thing about it is that that debate is continuing. So investors are now saying, I want to understand not just how much money a company is making, but how is that money being made? What value is being contributed or created over and above squeezing cash out of a system so that they can put it to the top? And the way this relates to what we've been talking about is that if you could, for example, really measure the value of the skills of your employees, if you could monetize or capitalize, meaning that you could really understand, then it would actually be valuable to the company to invest in training its workforce, and that you could measure that. And in turn, then people could say, well, I don't know how to compare these two companies. Well, one is investing in its workforce, building up its intellectual property, building up its human capital, and the other isn't. So even if their financial performance seems somewhat similar today, over time, we can expect that the one that's making those investments will do better. So we have isolated government programs and policies that say, please report on this, please report on that. I think the thing that I find exciting on a global scale, in which frankly the United States is behind, is this movement to ask companies to disclose the total package of value creation. So here's how we're, yes, making money, creating jobs, educating our workforce, contributing to the community, lowering our climate impact. These are all things that have value but that were not measured before. So coming back to what we're talking about, it seems to me that in addition to the uncomfortable conversations and the policy pieces, there really should be, at least potentially, and I know there are some of these, but a willingness, in fact even a requirement, to measure the steady increase in diversity and this, that, and the other. And I know the Boston City Council is pushing for that and has achieved some of that. So I guess this leads me to the question that interested me since I first read about your material. You have this program, it's going great, but to re-engineer the system, it's got to come to an enormous scale. And I know that tech industry is always thinking about how to go to scale. What is your idea about how this could go to scale? Resilient coder model could go to scale and make a substantive difference on wider and wider community.
Well, I think that resilient coders scaling is, so I have two responses to this. First, I think that it's important for me and for us as an organization to think beyond resilient coders. Right. So we're also having conversations with different organizations and different philanthropists to think differently, not just about resilient coders specifically, but about the broader ecosystem that within which we live. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan, for example, of trying to find a way to align different workforce organizations into an actual comprehensive pipeline, rather than sort of like a stack of pipes right now that will take you from here to here, rather than all the way from this point in the pipeline to the final point in the pipeline. I would love to have a well-understood, well-known, well-defined workforce development series of ladders, on-ramps and off-ramps that we can all contribute to. So that's one thing that I would love to see happen, and we're moving in that direction. So like in a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, that will be a thing, hopefully, knock on wood. Beyond that, resilient coders specifically, we are working in software engineering because that's where a lot of these high growth careers happen to be. That's not always necessarily going to be the case, and it's not just going to be only software engineering. So I see an instance of this in which we start to pick up other sort of coding adjacent skills, right? To expand the specific disciplines that we're training people for. So the way that this scales up is if there were a model like ours that were adaptive to or responsive to the local industry. Mm-hmm.